welcome back everyone for our second panel. This panel focuses on disinformation, in many respects sort of the flip side of the first panel of the day, thinking about the power and impact that social media had for good in the first panel and for disseminating truthful, important matters of public concern. And then we switch gears with this panel to think about the opposite. We are very careful in this symposium not to refer to it as news and fake news, in part because fake news has, as a phrase, has grown legs and been co-opted for political purposes in a wide variety of ways that are uncomfortable to lots of the panel members. But we want to think about problems that come with the virality and spread of falsehood in a social media environment. Let me introduce to you our distinguished panel of guests. We are really grateful to have three of the nation's top scholars on this question here to tackle the issue with us. I'll head down this way. Derek Bambauer joins us from the University of Arizona James E. Rogers College of Law. He's a professor of law there where he teaches internet law and intellectual property. His research focuses on internet censorship and cybersecurity. He's a former principal systems engineer at Lotus Development Corp., which is part of IBM, and spent 2 years as a research fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School, where he tested and studied internet censorship in countries like China and Iran and Vietnam. He holds an AB from Harvard College and a JD from Harvard Law School. Next to Derek is Hannah Bloch-Wehba. She is assistant professor of law at Drexel University's Kline School of Law. Her scholarship explores the intersection of civil liberties and cyber issues within the law, focusing on free expression, privacy, and government accountability. Prior to joining the faculty at Drexel, Hannah was a clinical lecturer in law, a research scholar, and a Stanton Foundation First Amendment Fellow at Yale Law School. Before entering academia, she worked for Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press in Washington, D.C., where she represented journalists and media organizations in matters involving First Amendment issues. And last but not least is Thomas Kadri, who is a resident fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project. Thomas writes about free speech and privacy in the digital age, and his research focuses on constitutional implications of private governance in the public sphere. His work has been published or is forthcoming in Michigan Law Review, the Southern California Law Review, and the Maryland Law Review. He also has written for the New York Times and Slate. He's an adjunct professor at New York Law School, where he teaches cybercrime. Thomas clerked on the Ninth Circuit for Judge Margaret McKeown and on the Southern District of New York for Judge Thomas Griesa. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Okay, we're going to dive right in. There are plenty of topics to discuss, and really, if we were having this panel focus exclusively on things that have been in the news in the last 72 hours, we still would not have enough time to talk about those things. But I want to try to sort of get the lay of the land and think about some of the major dynamics that are driving the more global conversation that we want to be having here. I want to start with you, Derek, and thinking about we're going to want to turn to some of the ad policy questions that folks have been are really interested in on Slido and that have been hot in the news. But I want to give you the chance, Derek, to think about disinformation in the sort of more content-based side of things, right? What we all are sharing with each other, not in the form of advertisement, but in the form of news stories. And one thing that I think you've been thinking about, and that might be a tricky question, is sort of, are the effects of this actually worse than the effects of disinformation or misinformation that existed pre-social media, right? People were always trying to convince each other of other things or propagandize each other or tell soft or hard lies to each other. Are the effects worse than those of pre-social media disinformation? Do we have any good mechanisms for testing that? And does it matter?
So it's a great question. I suspect that most of this, in terms of testing it, would have to be qualitative in nature. And the irony here is that I think that there's a significant trade-off between what we might think of as the scale, or the sort of how widespread or how viral the impact is, versus the magnitude of that impact, how large it is. And this, somewhat ironically, piggybacks off of the lack of trust that Americans have, not only in news media, but in institutions writ large. So if you look at since Watergate in the 70s, trust in almost everything except possibly the Army has plummeted, and even the US military has come in for a bit of a beating. So on the one hand, the viral nature of social media makes it much easier to spread misinformation or disinformation. But I also think it means, generally speaking, that the magnitude of the effects is smaller. And we could look to some historical antecedents to suggest that the presence of powerful gatekeepers who might be hacked, in a sense, in the pre-social media era, might mean that those gatekeepers, if they are fooled by misinformation or disinformation, have much larger knock-on effects. So a few examples might well be the sort of famous role of the Hearst newspaper chain in the Spanish-American War, largely selling this war in Cuba and with Spain as based on things like the disaster of the USS Maine. The lighter side, the H.G. Wells War of the Worlds broadcast over the radio, leading a non-trivial number of radio listeners to believe that, in fact, aliens were invading. And then on the more serious note, the ability of the second Bush administration to convince key reporters at both the New York Times and the Washington Post that, in fact, Iraq did possess weapons of mass destruction, were sort of instrumental in changing the kind of conventional wisdom around the scope and prospects of the war. It's sort of like if you can capture Judith Miller, it's a bit like capturing Walter Cronkite in days prior. So I think that that's one of the things that would be an interesting test, is that we have some nice historical examples of this, and the effects under certain measurements may actually be less bad in social media precisely because we're skeptical of these different types of gatekeepers.
And Thomas, why aren't we studying it? What barriers exist to our answering some of these? We have some really significant academic and really practical questions about what's happening in this new environment. What sorts of barriers exist? I know you've done some studying of the kinds of things, the ways that platform policies themselves might be getting in the way of our being able to really answer some of these questions effectively.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, it really breaks down, but there's certainly a lot of connection between the issue of the way that the law is approaching these questions and the way that private companies themselves are kind of doing it as a matter of governance internally. And so we see this in a couple of ways. I mean, one is just how restrictive platforms can be with their terms of service, in terms of allowing access to information about the platforms, so that researchers and journalists can have maybe more oversight about what's going on, and the sort of type of access that the platforms give. And we see a fair amount of diversity in the approaches that different platforms are taking. So you have, a company like Facebook that, especially in the wake of Cambridge Analytica, really started restricting access to data that it keeps about what's going on its platform. And you might think, rightly so, this was a huge shock and people saw it as a big privacy violation that was going on. And so maybe a good thing for there to be more scrutiny about the ways in which Facebook is choosing to share its data with outsiders. But of course, this can have huge ripple effects for the ability to understand what's going on the platforms. And so Facebook, for example, in response to some of the scandal and the fallout, basically shut down all of its APIs, which are the sort of applications that previously allowed at least some degree of oversight from people external to Facebook to understand what is going on. But then you have, a platform like Twitter that will give much more access to information about what's going on its platforms, but at a cost. Right? So then there's a question of, well, who can afford to have the type of access to have this scrutiny, and what role, do these gatekeepers now have in deciding who can research the platforms and what the nature of that research is? I've spoken to journalists for a paper that I'm currently working on to try and get a sense for what it does for their day-to-day job when they have to go to the platforms and basically ask for permission. And it has a couple of, at least a couple of fairly obvious consequences. I mean, one is there is this sense that their research, the integrity of their research is compromised because people think, oh, well, you only got access to the stuff that they're letting you see, which is a major problem. But then the other is this question of, well, then it allows the platforms to start cherry picking who they want to share that access with. So I think that is a big part of the issue of who is able to do this research and then how this research is getting done.
Hannah, you're our resident expert on disinformation as it relates to ad policy. And so the queen for the day, as bestowed by the New York Times headlines, right? And I want us to spend some time here on the panel thinking about that issue and particularly how it differs from content moderation issues. For those of you who have been living in a cave, there's been a lot of attention the last few days about Facebook ad policy and particularly criticism from various political wings about a Facebook advertising policy that seemingly allows for politicians to present false or misleading information in ads. So Joe Biden drew a lot of attention to this. Elizabeth Warren ran an ad containing a deliberate falsehood, sort of designed to highlight the nature of the policy. A lot of stories in the popular press have been focusing the public attention on this question in a new way in the last week. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about ways that you've been thinking about the ad policy before all of us started thinking about it, about this question, and maybe highlight for us some ways in which you think it's important for us to disaggregate our conversations about the effect and impact and regulation of disinformation in a content setting from an ad setting.
Yeah, to be fair, I feel like I started thinking about this like 3 weeks ago. So I guess in the speed of development at which we're currently moving, that's like a really long time ago. But so I think, and my remarks about this will mostly be Facebook specific because Mark Zuckerberg made a speech that touched on this yesterday at Georgetown. I think there are at least 3 ways in which the ad policy sort of developments are challenging to the ways that we've been thinking about content moderation more generally. The first is this question about newsworthiness. And my understanding, having watched that speech on double speed at 5 o'clock in the morning today,
I'm glad I wasn't the only one who did that.
is that Facebook is sort of taking the position that what politicians are saying in political advertising is inherently newsworthy. Now, for the reasons that I think we're discussing on the earlier panel, I'm not sure that that's the right approach to newsworthiness, but it also completely dodges the question of whether that newsworthy information inherently outweighs the risks of the presentation of falsity through these very powerful channels. I think it also suggests, perhaps intentionally, perhaps not, that different protections and presumptions apply to speech that is paid for as opposed to speech that is at least nominally unpaid for, paid for with our privacy and our data instead of our money. So to the extent that I think the platform is suggesting that a different set of presumptions and protections apply to speech that's paid for, I just don't see where that comes from, and instead seems to me to invert a lot of the assumptions that Facebook seems to be making about the power of the platform as a mouthpiece for average consumers. Second is that this distinction between disinformation in ads that are paid for and posts that are unpaid for, I just don't see any justification for it aside from this newsworthiness justification. And I think arguably misinformation and disinformation in paid advertising not only presents the same risks as in unpaid content, but also perhaps more egregious risks. And I think the co-optation of the platform by politicians and the sort of profit motive that entails, not a huge profit motive, but some profit nonetheless, is troubling when we think about the potential abuses there. And finally, and I think Thomas will have more to say about this, there's this sort of focus on authenticity, I think, as a proxy for understanding the likelihood that information, whether in paid advertising or unpaid posts, is going to be false. And that strikes me as an odd focus, right? I think the primary virtue, or a chief virtue of authenticity, is that a substantial amount of this inquiry about whether a post is likely to be false or not can be automated and screened for based on automated means, based on a sort of understanding of whether someone is likely to be a bot or associated with an inauthentic group or group of inauthentic actors. And that avoids a lot of the very difficult contextual inquiries about truth and falsity that I think we would have to deal with if we dealt with disinformation head on. I do agree that authenticity is a big part of the problem, but the idea that we should be using these sort of speaker-based distinctions to assess risk of disinformation strikes me as not inherently a more justifiable approach to the problem than making content-based or viewpoint-based distinctions. And so I wonder about the extent to which platforms are going to be relying moving forward on authenticity as a proxy for understanding the content of speech.
Thomas, follow up on this for us. You've done some thinking about the ways that Facebook, you and your co-author have written a lot to the envy of lots of other tech scholars, sort of as much from the inside of Facebook as lots of folks have managed to get. And you've done some thinking about the way that Facebook self-identifies its own core values. Describe for us this shift that Hannah alluded to and why it might matter to us.
Absolutely. So when you think about the way that Facebook governs speech, it's helpful to think about the progression that has led to this moment. I mean, it started with a bunch of people thinking about what speech should and shouldn't be allowed on the platform without too much nuance or expertise. It was just something that became apparent that needed to happen on some level because there were all sorts of complaints going on about the type of speech that was on the platform. And that was a long time ago, and Facebook has changed a lot now, whereas we all know there are thousands and thousands of content moderators who are individually reviewing pieces of content and making decisions about what should come up and what should stay down. But they're still doing so largely or almost entirely by reference to this set of community standards or community guidelines. And those are the rules that govern online speech on Facebook. And if it violates a community standard, then it comes down. And if it doesn't, then it stays up. Well, of course, as you can imagine, there are all sorts of really close calls that come up, especially when you're faced with billions of pieces of content or millions of pieces of content that are going up each week. And so part of what Facebook now is doing, as we heard about this morning in Andy's presentation, is thinking about, all right, different mechanisms of oversight that could give maybe more transparency, perhaps more consistency into the types of decisions that are being made. And then this is where this interesting shift in values is coming up. So when Facebook published its draft charter back, I think it was last November, for this oversight board, it listed this series of values that they said were going to help guide the oversight board and content moderators about the types of decisions that were being made. And it was this kind of laundry list of human rights buzzwords, like we value dignity, we value privacy, we value speech, we value voice. And, there was some sense in which perhaps that was going to lead to a more detailed version of these values in the final charter that might give more guidance about what Facebook meant by these values. But instead, in the final charter that was just released a few weeks ago now, it was still this list of kind of one-word values that the company has to judge its community standards against. But there were a couple of interesting switcheroos that happened. And I don't know how related they are, but just consider the fact that authenticity was not in the initial draft charter, but made its way into the final charter. And two that suddenly dropped out were equality and equity. And I don't know why that happened, right? I've tried, I have some insights into what's going on at Facebook, but I don't know why that happened. But consider what it means when thinking about what content should come up and or come down and stay up when you have this new push for authenticity, and Zuckerberg was big on speaking about that in his speech yesterday, and maybe less of an emphasis on certain other values that the company could have.
Yeah, one of the things that this sort of triggers in my thinking is a conversation, a piece of this conversation that we seem to be orbiting around, right, in all of the panels, which is that sort of social media is just now where we do speak to each other, right? It is just the new reality, and in particular, Facebook's sort of enormous dominance and architecture. Seems like it's a really important piece of the conversation right here. It really, if you are truly that dominant, the place where conversations are happening, then you really can't help but act as either a censor or a disseminator of propaganda, because you're the place where everybody's going to share whatever they're sharing, and even if they're sharing disinformation or misinformation. And so I think and I think Zuckerberg sort of hinted towards this, alluded towards this in some of his remarks at Georgetown, but also in his op-ed and in some other contexts this last week, right? Rock and hard place here for such a dominant organization. If you crack down on this, right, then you're setting yourself up as an arbiter of permissibly accurate political speech, right? For the whole, you're the new governors. I just made that up just off the cuff. That's definitely not the title of someone else's article. Okay, it is Kate Klonick. She's awesome. Okay, so that's the one hand, right? You crack down on this, you're setting yourself up as the arbiter of permissibly accurate political speech for the entirety of the world. And if you don't, then you're accused of poisoning the political conversation in ways that set you up as the villain. So what do we make of this rock and hard spot sort of dynamic here? And is Facebook's dominance itself something that needs to be addressed? Derek, do you have thoughts on that? And we can sort of make our way down. The damned if they do and damned if they don't.
Right, so it comes with having a huge stock market valuation, right? So it's one of those things.
Having a hard time feling sorry for them?
Yeah, I'm not crying too many tears. Although I do have enormous sympathy for two things. One is just that these things, everybody expects to be Facebook and nobody does, right? So that every startup thinks they're going to be highly successful, but nobody puts the infrastructure in place because there's no sense to it. You're just sort of working on your business plan and whatnot. And so these sort of more latent questions of values and normative orientation sort of come after the fact in the kind of like slightly ad hoc way that Thomas is talking about a little bit on the fly. The sort of second point is that inevitably they will have to make certain choices about content, whether to take it up or whether to leave it down, and that to a certain degree depends on their view of sort of type 1 versus type 2 errors, whether in any particular given point it's better to suppress this or to allow this. One thing that I think was quite notable from the Zuckerberg op-ed is the degree to which there is this kind of instinctive reliance on what I would call American free speech values, right? That the default is towards a slightly libertarian view of free speech, that we allow things to flourish. We are concerned about essentially acting in a paternalistic fashion. And that's right. I mean, that sort of point of view has been under sustained and I think a successful attack by sort of more postmodern scholars of free speech. But the orientation, right, the idea that many of these tech companies start off as American companies has some sort of initial gravity in the design of the platform, right, in terms of whether or not it's moderated. And then I think that I find it interesting that relatedly, the current war, although it may not be the next war, is about political speech, because this, I think, points up a sort of very strange tension in the room and in the debate, which is we are highly skeptical about paid political advertising. So if I am running a campaign for Congress and I want to buy an ad that says my opponent is a lying, drug-dealing weasel, I can do that now, and all of that may be absolutely false. But if all of a sudden, and we're critical of that, but if we transition from the social media lens to the constitutional law lens, there is nothing for which we would be more likely to mount the barricades than false political speech, right? That's U.S. versus all rights. I can lie about being a Medal of Honor winner, and there's not a darn thing anybody can do about it. And so I think that this tension in the values is quite strange, because normally we would say, great, what we have is we have a sort of trademark style built-in set of reputational consequences, which is if it turns out that Bambauer is lying about his opponent, how can we trust him not to lie to us? How can we trust him to make good decision-making? On the other hand, that slightly kind of this sort of Milton or Mill marketplace of ideas style model works really well in the long run, but as Keen said, in the long run, we're all dead. And so that, I think, is part of the question, is whether the sort of speed and dissemination of information, the decreased information costs of these platforms, in particular social media platforms, means that the somewhat longer-term corrective measures that we have do not suffice in the way that we've sort of historically thought about them as doing.
This certainly has been the predominant thread in the, I would say, in the last 72 hours of the sort of things that Zuckerberg are saying, right? It is a sort of a very heavy faith in and reliance on an American marketplace of ideas model, right? Did the two of you have thoughts about that, about the rock and hard place question or the marketplace of ideas approach?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess just to go back to Derek's first point that he was making about how, now with this sort of distributed nature where maybe disinformation doesn't have as much of an effect in some way, we don't have as many of the gatekeepers that we sort of used to have. I mean, that that really ties into the question of Facebook's dominance. It's true that many more people have the ability to engage in speech and publicize their voice, but it is also true that we have these dominant platforms that in some way are acting as the gatekeepers, or at least as the decision makers. And this makes me think of this tension that definitely exists when we get very Facebook's dominance can be seen very much as a blessing and a curse. It may be if what we're worried about is getting the bad stuff off the internet and controlling that, it's really helpful that there aren't that many actors where this is going on. And it makes it much easier for governments to regulate. I mean, the states isn't going to do that, mainly because of the First Amendment in a lot of instances, but it makes it a lot easier for Europe to go and say, well, we want to implement this particular type of, let's say, hate speech rule or privacy rule, and we know that there are really only a few companies that we're going to need to figure out how we'll do this for. We need to figure out how to get Google to take down search results, and we need to figure out how to get Facebook to take down particular hate speech. And then we've got rid of most of the problem for the internet. And you'll see sometimes Facebook embraces that. This is a reason why you shouldn't break us up, because it makes it so much easier for you to control these problems, right? But similarly, going back again to what Derek said, it also makes them much easier to hack. If the Russians figure out how to mess with Facebook's system, they can have a huge effect in a way that they might not have been able to do had we had this more diversified source of platforms out there. So it really is this blessing and curse for the ecosystem that we now have. The other thing I'd say, though, in response to this idea that Facebook embodies this American view of free speech that errs on the side of leaving things up. It's undoubtedly true, and Zuckerberg really lent on that yesterday in his speech. But there are some really interesting exceptions when that hasn't been the case. So when Facebook was dealing with a whole lot of flack for being a locus of cyberbullying, which, I mean, it still does, but really when this was initially first something that a lot of people were outraged at because their kids were getting mercilessly bullied on these platforms, Facebook adopted a very speech restrictive rule. It said, we can't figure out when bullying is going on because that requires such a contextual analysis. So if you complain that you're being bullied on the platform, we're just going to take the speech down. We're going to err on the side of censorship. So there are times when it really doesn't go with that approach. And I think it's sort of interesting to think about the reasons why it sometimes chooses to go in that direction versus others.
Kenny, did you have thoughts?
I mean, I find it difficult to feel bad, right? I feel like Facebook built the rock and it built the hard place. So at this point, by virtue of having developed a business model that relies on instantaneous publication, that is what creates both the rock and the hard place. And of course, Facebook now owes it to its shareholders as a matter of fiduciary duty to fight to preserve that business model. So to me, that is the source of both the tensions that it's operating under. I agree completely that what we see, especially in the last couple of days, expressed in both the op-ed and in the speech is this very fundamentally libertarian, almost classic American view of what free speech does. And it's interesting to me that I think Zuckerberg sort of gestures to this sort of critical approach to speech. He gestures to the need for equality and the ways in which commitments to equality might actually temper our commitments to free speech as such. But he doesn't seem to grapple with it very closely. And so I think that moving forward, one of the questions I have is about the extent of these commitments to this particular vision of the marketplace of ideas. Strikingly to me, I've always thought that there are two basic justifications for the marketplace of ideas sort of concept. One is that cream rises to the top and the best ideas will sort of win out in the long run, and this is, I think, what Derek was talking about. The other is that it's just not worth it to suppress the bad ideas. You don't have to believe that cream will rise to the top to think that it's unjustifiable to suppress wrong-headed ideas. And that's the concept of the marketplace that I think is actually more compelling, and it's notably not anywhere to be found in Zuckerberg's speech or is op-ed, the idea that some ideas actually are bad, but we should tolerate them anyway because the cost of suppressing them is too great. That seems to me to be more justifiable and yet nowhere to be found.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so one of the things that we collectively agreed as a group of panelists was that we could not conceivably get down into the weeds about every possible proposal that has ever been made for managing or tackling this sort of massive structural and technical and societal and democratic problem of disinformation. And then the flip side of that is that we wanted to at least have some cursory discussions about the kinds of solutions that have been proposed and how we could go about learning more about whether those solutions would be feasible. So what I want to do at this portion of the panel is just throw out the sort of kind of spectrum of solutions that have been floated out there and see if we can get some panel thoughts on those, both about sort of why these different approaches to tackling the problem of disinformation are so different from each other, but also thoughts about what would success look like, right? What is the target? What would success look like in dealing with disinformation? Sort of who should define it and where should the nexus of responsibility reside for managing disinformation in the current media landscape and why? So we have this sort of array of things that very smart people across the country, including folks on the dais right now, have been thinking about AI solutions to tackling the spread of disinformation. Other sort of less algorithmic platform content control measures, some of which have been mentioned on this panel and others. Media literacy efforts that focus on consumers of disinformation rather than producers or distributors of it. Governmental regulation, heavy top-down mechanisms that punish or that penalize or that fine or that shut down mechanisms of disinformation. And so I want to just sort of toss open to the group, what do we know about that spectrum, right? What sort of defines that spectrum of solutions, and how might we go about deciding whether something would work, and if it did work, right? What is the goal, right? What does success look like? Who wants to tackle first?
All right. So I would say, just as a general proposition, I am skeptical in this area of regulation being a particularly valuable tool if the regulation gets too specific about the technical responses that are required. And that's just because this is a space that changes so quickly, and because I'm skeptical that legislatures have the answers any better than the platforms themselves have. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no role for legislation. This isn't like a totally libertarian point. It's just to say that the type of regulation that may be most beneficial in this space may leave room, a bit of wiggle room for experimentation by these platforms. And I am skeptical of moves that push centralization and homogenization of both practices and policies in this area, because from what I've seen, there really is value in having different platforms experimenting with different governance regimes and different types of policies for us to move in a better direction of figuring out the harms that come about from online speech. And we've seen already a couple of governments toying with these ideas, this idea of, well, maybe we're not going to mandate specific types of procedures or, technical responses to particular problems, but we are going to demand a certain amount of oversight into what you're doing and how you're doing this. That's not to say that transparency solves everything in this area. It absolutely doesn't, and there is a role for more direct regulation. But having more insights into the ways that these platforms are treating these issues, I think will help, and it might lead us towards better architectural solutions that the law just won't be able to mandate in a quick enough time to deal with these problems. So here I'm thinking about things like WhatsApp deciding that we're going to stop allowing mass forwarding of messages because of the role that played in spreading disinformation in communities like Brazil and India, which a bunch of people in Silicon Valley previously hadn't thought of. Surprise, surprise, because WhatsApp is not as much of a tool used in this country, and disinformation of that type is not something that we had maybe been as conscious about. But they were able to implement some sort of architectural solution that it seems like from early reports is having a positive effect. Another example, though, that springs to mind is what Twitter is now doing when a public figure or somebody who is newsworthy violates their terms of service or violates their sort of community guidelines, is not to take the tweet down, but to put some sort of notice that says, we're leaving this up, but you should know that this violates our policy on hate speech or whatever else. This is who knows if that's going to be the right response, the right balance to be struck here. It may be that the tweet should come down entirely, but I, for one, am interested to see what role those kinds of architectural responses have to the problems that we face, and I wouldn't want to see regulation come in and stop that sort of experimentation.
Hannah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think platforms have many, many more tools in their toolkit than a simple sort of binary choice between whether information stays up or comes up in the first place and whether it should come down. And Twitter's experimentation is a great example of this. I also think that there are a lot of other regulatory or soft regulatory models that could be fruitful in achieving the goal of making platform decision-making more robust and more transparent and more evidence-based. And so something I'm thinking about is a sort of almost like an inspector general model, right? Which is to say, not that all the information should necessarily be disclosed to the public as a matter of course in a sort of FOIA model, but that there are forms of expert governance and standard setting that we could, I think, productively deploy here to inform platforms and to draw from platforms the information that's necessary to actually study empirically the effects of disinformation. And one model that I'm thinking about that I think would never fly in America, but is worth contemplating, is the model of the French misinformation law, which requires platforms to sort of open themselves to scrutiny for a 6-month sort of trial period where the government can study what they're doing, all sorts of problems with that, but an interesting model, and then has a sort of fire alarm, quick response system built in for misinformation and disinformation that's spread during an election period. Now, that obviously wouldn't work in America, not least because our election season lasts for 4 years.
Derek, thoughts?
Let me share 3 quick thoughts. The first is that I'm actually substantially skeptical about literacy education programs. And I think that if we look at the history of media literacy education programs, we will find a sort of vast field of failure. In computer software, we used to say that whenever you make software idiot-proof, they just improve the idiots. So I'm skeptical of it, and part of the reason I'm skeptical of it is something that David Green said on the last panel, which is that everybody pretty much agrees that this is a good thing to do. And I think this has a lot to say about the political economy of media literacy efforts. It doesn't require anyone to sacrifice anything, right? So it's something that everyone can agree on, but that will have very little effect. So it won't actually move things forward, right? The part where some stakeholder starts to scream is when you actually think it might be having some impact. My second thought is about this sort of more procedural approach, which Facebook is taking with the oversight board, and which there are a number of other models out there. And transparency in many ways is kind of a sort of core American value. We have it in things like our Freedom of Information Act at the federal level and state sunshine laws and the like. The difficulty is that transparency works only so well. And part of the problem is this is one of the few spaces where I find the difference or distinction between misinformation and disinformation to be compelling, right? The difference between those two, is commonly framed, is that disinformation represents an attacker with intent, whereas misinformation is simply that I'm ignorant and I share it. Normally speaking, my question is, what is intent doing for us here? We use it as a proxy for things like deterrence or mens rea or blameworthiness. I don't think that does a lot, except here, which is that the greater the transparency, right? What we have to think about is the threat model against Facebook and other platforms, which is if you have motivated attackers who are going to attempt to reverse engineer whatever solution that you put in place so as to spread further disinformation, you have to assume that there is a sort of backbending curve to transparency. There's a point where you disclose so much that you allow them to sort of stay one step ahead of your remediation efforts. And that means that you're sort of running in place as fast as you can to catch up. And then the last thing I would say is that platform counterspeech is a really interesting example. I'm glad that Thomas raised it. It's something that's been knocking around for a while. So a few years ago, Yevgeny Morozov proposed this for Google, right? So if you did you searched Google for Jew back in the day, it would turn up jewwatch.org, which is an anti-Semitic white supremacist site. And one of the things that Google did is it actually had a disclaimer, right? It had a box off to the side that says, just so you know, this is a hate speech site. And that's something that is in some tension with Google's own core values, which is we don't make these choices, right? We simply reflect the kind of extant exogenous choices that our users make. I think it's potentially quite powerful. The difficulty, of course, is that it works better in some spaces than others, and it works particularly poorly in political spaces, right? So my claim that ultimately what we need to do is we need to have the revolution and the vanguard of the proletariat, and that's the way to sort of get meaningful political reform. Very difficult to empirically disprove. On the other hand, if what I say is it turns out that the earth is flat, right? If you keep sailing, you'll fall off the edge. We're all fairly confident, not all, but most of us are fairly confident that that's not true. And so a lot of the counter-speech, a lot of the sort of potential for counter-speech rests in the degree to which things are empirically verifiable or sort of disprovable.
RonNell, could I just piggyback on one quick thing that Derek said there, which is absolutely right, that this shift where all of these platforms really were just so dead set on remaining neutral for, PR reasons, maybe more than anything else, has started to shift a little bit, and I do think that that is for the better. So when you have these kinds of counter-speech models, they necessarily involve some sort of expression of value judgments that these platforms are making. And it used to be, well, first of all, it used to be that we never used to get any transparency about why they were changing their policies. So we couldn't even judge their value, the value judgments they were making, other than just looking at the rules and trying to guess what maybe motivated the change. And now we started to see a bit of a shift there, and I, for one, am in favor of even more of a shift, where I was just talking about this last night, actually. When Facebook changed its approach towards white supremacists as a group, it released kind of a statement about why it was doing it. And for me, it was a breath of fresh air in terms of transparency and helping us understand why they went about doing this. And it was so in tension with previous models of we're just neutral, all we are is the neutral platform. It really grappled with the fact that here was our policy before towards white supremacists. This is why we had this policy. We've done some thinking about it, and we've spoken to other people, and now we're going to change it. But we recognize that not everyone's going to be happy with it because it involves this trade-off, which is why we had the first policy that we had. But this is a question of values, and we're now coming down on this side of the values. And yes, that's not always going to be possible for all sorts of different types of political speech, but having that as at least more of a model in terms of the relationship that these platforms have with the public, I think would be a good thing. It's taking ownership of the fact that there are all sorts of normative judgments that are going on here and being transparent and open about them. Then at least we can start having a better conversation about, all right, well, are those the right values? And hopefully move the conversation forward there.
Okay, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to engage with our assembled scholars and also with the mounting set of questions here. But I have a sort of last set of questions for the panel in our panel setting about ways that we can think about the architecture of platforms themselves as being key to these solutions, right? A lot of what we've heard on the problem side of things is there are certain things about the ways that they lead to virality and the ways that they lead people to act without thinking, and the ways that people are siloed in their ideological silos and instantly believe what they see on them. So there are architectural problems that we've certainly alluded to and discussed at length. But I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about ways that the architectures of the platforms might be key to solutions here. I'll start with Thomas on a really specific level, and maybe the others can answer it on a broader level. I know, Thomas, you've been thinking in your research about what we can learn from parallel areas of other regulation of other kinds of harmful speech, not disinformation, but other sorts of harmful speech. Cyber harassment, you mentioned bullying, cyber stalking is another example, and sort of trying to glean what things about the architecture of the platforms or the approaches taken in those other problematic areas might be models for creative thinking in the disinformation area. Do you have thoughts that you want to share with us about sort of how we could go about that comparative analysis and why it might be fruitful?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, I do think that there are some crossovers between disinformation and issues, particularly surrounding harassment and stalking, because both of them rely often on themes of anonymity. Authenticity kind of comes up again. You know, if the source of the harassment or the stalking is because somebody is, you know, being able to shield their identity and thereby engage in abusive behavior that they otherwise couldn't do using, you know, old forms of communication, that's been a problem that platforms have had to face, and they've had to think about, all right, what are the trade-offs here? And I think we're going to see a lot of similar trade-offs being made in the disinformation realm as well. And this, I think, leads me to, you know, one of the looming issues here, which is Facebook's increasing push towards private communicative forums and encryption, and how that's going to affect both questions of harassment and stalking and those kinds of harms, but also disinformation. It's being heralded by Mark Zuckerberg, at least, as a push for privacy and for security and for sort of safety of people who want to engage in dissident speech. And it can be all of those things, right? Certainly encryption does have protections for those kinds of values, but it also leads to a lot more opacity about what's going on the platform. It leads to less responsibility for the platforms about what's being said on them. If they can actually say, no, we can't moderate for this speech anymore because even we can't see what's going on within these forums, it gets rid of a lot of problems for them. So there's a, you know, there's a sort of self-interested motive, I think, that's baked in to some of these architectural choices that are being made. And again, not to, you know, beat a dead horse, but it does come back to being open about the value judgments that you're making. It's recognizing that encryption is neither wholly good nor wholly bad. It just comes with different winners and losers. And if we're, you know, it just requires that kind of judgment. And let's have a conversation about, you know, why we're picking the winners that we're picking and why we're picking the losers that we're picking, and not assume that one architectural solution is going to solve everything or make everything bad.
Yeah. Hannah and Derek, thoughts about the ways that the same tools that are creating the problems that have been identified might also be tapped as resources in solutions?
I find it difficult to contemplate potential solutions to the problem of disinformation, but really the problem of most harmful online content without thinking about the systems that are used to rank and display the information in the first place. I think often about James Grimmelman's sort of little pithy title, "The platform is the message," right? Which is to say, the problem of harmful content is the same, or is the flip side of the architecture that displays all the content to us. So it seems, and this is a very unformed thought, but it seems to me like any potential solution to the problem of harmful content has to come with a sort of equivalent open discussion of the ranking and prioritization of content to begin with.
And so does this mean algorithmic transparency?
I mean algorithmic transparency, and that's a discussion that I think has largely been siloed off from the discussion about content moderation to our peril and to the platform's peril. These are not different questions. They are just two ends of the same spectrum, and a solution requires addressing the whole spectrum.
And I'll just note that the Facebook Oversight Board has been very specific that it's just dealing with content decisions, and it doesn't see it as, looking at things like the algorithm, So there is oversight coming in this area, but maybe, as Hannah says, it's not oversight in the areas that makes the most sense.
Yeah. Derek.
I think it's interesting just the degree to which some of these questions are bound up with sort of longer running and larger societal debates. So this is like version 4 of the encryption wars that we've had, right? It starts under Louis Freeh, under Clinton, and now we have Bill Barr writing a letter to Facebook saying, that the sky will fall. The sky actually doesn't fall. It turns out that all sorts of encrypted things, take a look at Tor, any other sort of encryption, has all sorts of bad things happening on it, right? So it is in fact used by drug dealers and people with child sex abuse materials and the like. But that's a sort of larger question, which is, okay, do we value sort of enhancing dissident speech at a certain volume with this undeniable cost? And that's a sort of very difficult trade-off. It's not really a utilitarian one in some sense. It's somewhat deontological. And then I think that the other piece is that, again, learning from history is really useful, is that these questions about sort of algorithmic transparency, particular gaming, the idea of a motivated attacker, Google's been dealing with these for a long time, right? So that's search engine optimization. And what they wound up doing, right, was, as Thomas pointed out, largely abandoning the sort of political or rhetorical conceit that these rankings are entirely technical and neutral, and rather realizing that they are sort of contested and socially constructed. And so I don't know whether transparency measures are going to do that work, because it might be that transparency is just a cost. I might care only if Facebook is doing a good job about taking down the stuff that I dislike and leaving up the stuff that I think is laudable. I don't necessarily need to know how the sausage is made. So I think that in one sense, we should remain flexible about technical and technological solutions. So there are certainly ways, whether good or bad, of doing things like key escrow or other ways of sort of dealing with some of the problems of this, the model that sort of encryption is where the internet goes dark is a technologically naive one and not a sophisticated one. And the second thing is that we can develop different types of procedures, right? Not everything has to look like the Supreme Court in terms of appellate review for it to work reasonably well. So I think some of this is just, and this will come out of something that Hannah pointed out, which is that we need to, at some level, encourage experimentation. Is that, and the degree to which Facebook, Twitter, or other platforms can experiment with these things and then describe the results of that experimentation to us in a sort of meaningful public way, I think would be an enormous service.
Okay, I want to open to questions from the assembled symposia experts, and then we're collecting questions here that we'll make sure that we get asked. David.
Yeah, thanks. This is, a fascinating look at this intractable problem. But I'm curious about the looking to other types of online harms as a model, because there's something that strikes me as different about misinformation, is that whereas in harassment and cyberbullying, what we're really, one of the solutions we focus on is user controls. How can users make sure they don't receive this material? Disinformation, the problem seems to be more of a stupid neighbor problem, where it's, I don't fall for that hoax, but my stupid neighbor does, and I don't want someone else getting the information. So how do we account really for that? We're looking at a different breed of people don't just want to control their own feeds, they want to control other people's feeds. How do we, either in a regulatory model or how do we account for that? And I don't know the answer.
Yeah. I agree that that's a distinction and an important one to pay attention to, but I will just say that I think it's not quite as clean-cut a distinction as your question suggests, in that, yes, the primary harms that we're getting at when we're worried about things like harassment and stalking are to individuals and sort of these personal harms, whereas, yes, with misinformation and disinformation, we're worried about both stopping third parties from doing things, but also broader societal harms that flow from this. We care about disinformation because we're worried that it's going to swing an election and therefore have an effect on society and our own lives as well. But I think we need to think about harms that flow from harassment more holistically too, right? Part of the reason why we care about the architecture of platforms not allowing that kind of conduct is not just to protect the victim of the particular harassment, but to have a vision of these platforms as places where people don't feel afraid to come and be part of the conversation. And so part of it is about having Twitter not be this cesspool where female journalists are scared to have account, or Facebook as a place where you're going to automatically get cyberbullied. It's not just about protecting the individual victims from the harms, but it's about thinking, how do we create an ecosystem and an environment that is more inclusive for society and that leads us in those directions. So in that sense, I think it's also helpful to draw parallels between the two spaces. But I agree that it's definitely a distinction that complicates the comparison.
Tanya, did you have a question?
Yes. So when I talk to my law students about this, I will, about Facebook and sort of the new public square that it's become, and I will ask them, do you think First Amendment principles should apply here? And, resoundingly, the answer is always yes, that we shouldn't be able to discriminate my posts based on their content, and I should be able to have sort of heightened due process rights if they do that, and, I should have all these rights. But as they keep talking, invariably, you start hearing things about how, and they should get rid of all that horribly racist speech and that sexist speech, and, these things that, of course, in the First Amendment, hate speech is protected, or this dangerous speech that can rile people up, where, of course, under the First Amendment, you have these really heightened incitement tests that you have to meet, and the lies, like they need to get rid of the lies, and as Jarek was talking about, that under the First Amendment, yeah, you get to lie, like that's what we protect, and these are law students who I know understand the First Amendment because I taught them, right, and it just makes me think that I think a lot of people feel this way with that. What they really want is this sort of First Amendment-y platform. And I'm wondering if that's problematic, if there should be more of a pushback to Zuckerberg coming out, with an American flag and the Bill of Rights, talking about the First Amendment, and then we need either to go all in or not, like all in, and this is a quasi-government, institution of somehow that has to follow the same principles, or like really push back on even talking about the First Amendment and be like, this is a consumer product. We are selling you this platform to communicate with people. Maybe it can be regulated as a consumer product, but this is what you're going to get from us. You'll get the Nazis on this one, or you won't get the Nazis on this one. And, but I'm just curious if you think the constitutionalizing of this is problematic.
Two fingers just to elaborate a little bit on that, which is to say we talked a lot about American values and how imbued they are in these platforms. And not only is that rather exceptionalist, but we are now seeing that there's going to be very strong, including legal pushback on that. So the Court of Justice of the European Union came down with a couple of decisions in the last few weeks, which clarify that there is nothing under European law that prohibits EU member states from requiring, specifically in the case at hand, Facebook to take down what they consider to be hate speech, which probably would not have been prohibited or prohibitable under U.S. law, not just in the member state, and not just in the EU, but globally and prospectively. So future iterations of the same speech. That's just a permissive ruling, and we'll see if EU member states take advantage of that, but I wouldn't be surprised. And so you are going to see Europe starting to flex its muscles legally over platforms like Facebook in the speech realm in the way they already have on data protection and privacy. And so that's going to be a real, what will Facebook do when an Austrian court says you must take this content down? Will they go to a U.S. court and try and get a decision, declaratory judgment that says we can't take this down, at least in the United States. And then what happens? I mean, this is becoming real very, very quickly, and I think it heightens some of these concerns in ways that we haven't yet really explored.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh, are we? Okay.
If that's okay.
Do you want to ask a question with this clump? Is it?
Yeah, I'm building directly on Jason.
Oh, excellent. Good. Yeah, great.
If that's okay.
Please do.
So my name's Rebecca MacKinnon. I direct the Ranking Digital Rights program at New America. I'm going to speak at the end of the last session, so I hope some of you will stick around. I won't repeat now what I'm going to bring up then, but just to build on Jason, I mean, wouldn't Zuckerberg have done a better job of strengthening Facebook's position vis-a-vis Europe and regulators in many places if he had planted his flag with Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights rather than the First Amendment, which doesn't apply to Facebook anyway? And then also one thing that I'm not going to go into so much later is the fact that, Facebook, obviously isn't applying the First Amendment to its platform at the moment anyway. And it's failing to be sufficiently transparent in all kinds of ways about all the different ways in which content might be constrained or shaped on its platform or access to information. And so, yeah, it just seems that planting the flag with the First Amendment makes no sense in the context of what Facebook actually is and its global reach. So interesting.
Great. Let's tackle this as a clump and think about what's motivating Facebook to describe itself in First Amendment-y terms, and is that useful to us as consumers of information and useful to Facebook as a world participant, or was it a misstep? Anybody?
So I wonder whether part of this push to embrace First Amendment principles rather than human rights principles, or rather than free expression under European law, for example, might be partly a response to the wave of regulation that is coming from Europe and an attempt to sort of plant a flag and say, we're going to be seeking that declaratory judgment in the Northern District of California that says these obligations are unenforceable, at least as applied to our US operations. I think that is coming. It's already come for Google, and there's no reason to suspect that it's not also coming for Facebook. And so I wonder whether there's an element of that sort of geopolitical calculation that's happening. There's also something strikingly weird to me about this embrace, which is to say, we stand for First Amendment principles, but we don't think we should make these decisions. Please regulate us, governments of the world. And I'm like, but in Derek's words, this sort of looks a lot like saying, please jawbone me, right? Like, which is to say, we know we have this responsibility and we know we have this liberty under the First Amendment, but we don't want to use it. We're going to ask the government to regulate us in ways that are also very inconsistent with constitutional law. And so it just, to me, I mean, is a thorny thicket of sort of First Amendment questions about what values are really deeply held and what is basically political gamesmanship at this point.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think all of the issues that have just been raised about applying the First Amendment to Facebook are really valid, and especially the one that Hannah just mentioned. But I have a different problem with it, which is when we start talking about Facebook as the public square, or as like the internet as the modern public square, it suggests something that is just demonstrably false, which is that the internet is a monolith, or even that Facebook itself is one thing, when of course it isn't. And the problem with the idea of like the First Amendment applying here is this suggestion. The way that it's actually being used is what we want is the First Amendment rules for the public square. to apply across all of these platforms. And that would just be foolish, right? Because there are so many different types of cyberspaces that are out there, and different rules may be appropriate. Even if we were to apply the First Amendment, we would need to do it in a hell of a lot more of a nuanced way than this conversation suggests. And I mean, that I think needs to be part of this, is that, yeah, anonymity might be really important on some platforms, and some platforms might want to move in that direction, but it might be a source of tremendous harm on a different type of platform. And I'd rather have us, think more, not should the First Amendment apply or not, in that sort of shorthand way for should we be able to do exactly what we do in the public square, and actually think about the different types of cyberspaces that are out there and what different rules should apply to them.
Yeah, I want to take this moment to tap into a theme that I've seen in some of the Slido questions, and that I wish that I could get back to the question, the queue of questions that were lined up in the last panel. There were a couple of people who alluded to this as well, and so because I'm seeing this sort of trajectory of interest amongst people in the audience, I want to make sure that we ask it. And this is sort of the broad theme here, if I'm sort of consolidating them, is this question about the interplay between the things that we're talking about here and the tense partisan American political dynamic at the moment, right? So a number of people point out that the target of accusations of disinformation on social media are mainly conservative sources, right? That a part of what we've seen in the recent spurt of headlines about Zuckerberg are that, right, people are upset that he met with conservative leaders and that he pushes back that, of course he met with them, right? He meets with all sorts of people, and that he's a space for conversations on both sides of the aisle. What is the role of, if we're thinking about solutions here, how important is it that we have people from all political vantage points at the table, and how divisive are the proposed solutions from different sides of the political aisle? Do we think that people's sense of how great the disinformation problem is, and people's sense of what the correct solutions to the disinformation problem are politically driven? Does anybody want to chime in on that? It would seem our audience thinks so.
I think that there's absolutely a division on what disinformation is, what kinds of disinformation might be problematic, and how much this problem is a real one. I think that is absolutely informed by our political beliefs. And I think that the interesting thing is that dissatisfaction with the way that tech companies are addressing a whole bunch of different kinds of harmful content seems to me to be bipartisan. Partly that's about, I think, the inadequacy of representation with companies, right? Which is to say, I think that there are a lot of groups who don't feel that they're being heard, and that for any potential solutions to have any kind of legitimacy, they do have to be sort of cross-partisan, and also probably realistically not limited to one issue like disinformation. On the flip side, given the current political climate, I'm not sure that companies can do much to craft a participatory sort of way for folks to have their voices heard that will actually legitimate this process or this decision making. So I think it might be doomed to fail.
Oh, excellent. Sunny prognostication. Another theme that I'm seeing in the questions is a theme that I might label the sort of risk of the fox guarding the hen house, right? Audience members have concerns that a lot of the proposals that you're suggesting are proposals that are generated by the platforms themselves because they have the most knowledge, because they've blocked other people out of having that knowledge, but also because they have the most resources, right, about what's happening right now and what's coming up next. So, for example, some questioners suggest, given the things that Derek was suggesting about how newsworthiness has been a particularly powerful legal justification and how courts have historically really especially valued political speech, and courts have protected lies, right, that falsehoods aren't punishable. The question is, should we really expect platform to restrict some of these kinds of speech when our laws make space for accommodating it. Does anybody want to speak to the what incentive do you have as a platform to clean up the marketplace of ideas when the courts are allowing a more fulsome marketplace of ideas? And what trust should we have in social media platforms regulating in ways that are in our best interests when they're not required to do so? Anybody?
I mean, more to the second question that you posed, RonNell, I think I have some fears in this regard that the incentives certainly aren't set up to have the platforms making the best sort of public regarding decisions, but maybe worse than that. I mean, if we're already worried about Facebook making decisions for Facebook and Twitter making decisions for Twitter and them having this level of power, I'm even more worried about something that I'm seeing hints at, which is collaboration between the platforms in making these decisions. And here I'm thinking, again, a little bit about the oversight board, which is it first gets raised as this idea that it's just going to be the Facebook Supreme Court and it will decide Facebook issues. And now the messaging has started to shift in the last few weeks, which is we're building this board because we're hoping that others will join us in this venture. And Zuckerberg in his op-ed sort of talking about, we want to create this model for the industry so that everybody jumps on board. And what I hear when I hear that is, wouldn't it be great if everybody had the same rules? Why? Well, because then we aren't going to get singled out for criticism as much anymore. And the barriers to entry for other people who want to create different types of, speech regimes as a way of differentiating themselves and maybe chipping away at the market dominance of the current platforms seems a lot harder. And so I'm really, I understand the impulse of saying we want them to adhere to international human rights standards. There should be an industry-wide board that makes them do that. It sounds good in principle if we agree that that's the standard they should be setting. I'm just worried about moves to homogenize in this area and the collaboration that we already see between these platforms. There's a great scholar at Harvard, Evelyn Douek, who's writing a paper about this right now, all about sort of content cartels. This idea that, when does collaboration in this space move into collusion? And what are going to be the effects for the ecosystem here? I think we're still really far away from figuring out when do we want these platforms talking to each other and making these shared decisions. It's fine when it's to get child pornography off all of their platforms. Maybe it's fine when terrorist content, but we're a little more nervous about that. Well, what is it if we all agree that they should have the same hate speech code? What is it if, and on and on. I think that's something that we're only now starting to grapple with, but I think we're moving more in that direction of consolidation.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to ask a question from an audience member who wants you to imagine yourself omnipotent. I would like each panel member to pretend for a moment that he or she is all-powerful. Rather than telling us anything more about the problems, what action would you take to solve the problem of disinformation? You get 15 seconds, and the Facebook people have their notebooks out. They're ready.
Can't we all just get along?
Everybody was coming up after the news panel to say, you ended on such a down note, right? Democracy is doomed and people are stupid. Try harder this next time around. Did someone say something hopeful in our remaining 45 seconds about paths forward on disinformation?
Let me try. So
okay.
It's quite much depends, of course, on what you think the problem of disinformation is. Sidelining that, since I'm omnipotent, I would like to congratulate the Boston Red Sox on their World Series this year. Takes care of the Yankees. What I would say is two things. One is that I think that the platforms, if I were omnipotent, would concentrate on the relatively solvable problems. And those are ones where we have some empirical basis. And I think that there's a way of doing this, at least at a small scale initially, that solves some of the political choice conundrums that we've been facing, right? So ideally, Facebook has chosen at this moment to sort of invoke American values, and that naturally invokes, in a way that we've discussed, the American partisan divide that exists and is perhaps as bad as it's been, at least in a century of our politics. Pick an issue on either side. Right. So on the one hand, it would be nice to see Facebook push fairly hard against the anti-vax crowd, right, where there is just no science to support the idea that vaccines in any way cause autism or have any of these other harmful effects. And that tends to be a set of people who are largely politically left, right? So the people who are spreading misinformation tend to be on the left end of the spectrum. So that'd be one thing, right, is that we can annoy the progressives. That's good. On the other side, what we could do is that we could look at people who are sort of hardcore climate change deniers. And we could say, no, if your claim is that the Earth isn't warming, right, if you're James Inhofe and you bring a snowball to the Senate, right, then we decide that you've sort of had your time and we push off on an ice floe and wish you well. And so that's the idea, is that if we're going to have to put in place solutions that will necessarily annoy people on the political divide, we might as well at least annoy people equally or sort of in all ways, because at least that makes Facebook or other platforms look more like an honest broker. And it means that they might have success if they sort of narrow the scope of the problems that they claim to tackle.
Excellent. Thank you so much for ending us on a positive note. Join me in thanking our panel. Let me also just announce that our keynote lunch will take place beginning at 12:30. So you can take a little break and then make your way down to the end of the hall. Law review students and other helpers will be sort of directing you. There's a particular flow that they'd like people who are, I'm speaking to those who are physically present now. I know that there's lots of people watching us. The broadcast will begin for them at 12:30. The rest of you can take a break and then make your way down to the far end of the hall to enter in so that you can get your lunch and make your way to the tables in an orderly fashion. They'll be out there to direct you. We'll look forward to reconvening in 15 minutes or so. Thanks, guys.